Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery podcast, a place where we explore the world of horror and mystery in film, television, literature, and popular culture. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another show. My name is Bruce Markusen, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host and producer, Tracy Asteria. Tracy, what's going on with you this week?
Gosh, not a whole lot, Bruce. I've been kind of watching some spooky movies, and it's been a little cool and damp here. So definitely into the holiday season that I love almost as much as Christmas. How's everything going with you?
Really good. I've had a lot of fun decorating our front lawn. We just bought some more Halloween trinkets today. We're on a bit of a shopping spree. We worked on the inside of the house as well. The weather is definitely getting cooler. In fact, just the other night, I took a ghost tour at Hyde Hall, which is at the other end of Lake Otsego. So kind of at the other end of Cooperstown. My wife and I went on that. We both really enjoyed it. So definitely feeling more and more like Halloween the closer we move to this great holiday.
Yes, that's right.
You know, Tracy, I have been dying for a long time to talk about Alfred Hitchcock and his films and his work, but we've been waiting for the right guests. And on this week's episode, well, we have that person. We're very grateful to have with us as our guest, Professor Sidney Gottlieb. He is an author, editor, scholar, really one of the leading experts on Alfred Hitchcock. He is currently a professor of communications and media studies at Sacred Heart University, where he has taught since 1976. In fact, he is teaching a Hitchcock class this very semester. In 2024, he won Sacred Heart's Scholarship Award. He's also the co-editor of the Hitchcock Annual and has edited several books on the legendary filmmaker, including Hitchcock on Hitchcock and Alfred Hitchcock Interviews. So we're really looking forward to this discussion. We'll discuss with Sidney his interest in Alfred Hitchcock, the horror aspects of Hitchcock's films, and really what makes Hitchcock such a lasting figure in cinema. Sidney, welcome to the Ghostly Gallery. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm really getting into the holiday spirit with your introductions. And when I hear the word holiday, I tend to gravitate towards, oh, it must be Thanksgiving or Christmas.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. Halloween is one of the big ones. And I think part of the rationale, I guess, for turning to Hitchcock now is Hitchcock's got some Halloween in him and vice versa. So I'm really looking forward to talking with you guys about all that.
Well, we appreciate having you as well. So, Sidney, I first became interested in Hitchcock through two books. And for those watching on our YouTube channel, I'm going to hold up the books. One of them is this one, Haunted Houseful, which I got, I think, way back in 1972. It's about a decade after it came out. And then the other book, and this is where we came up with the name, or I came up with the name for the podcast, The Ghostly Gallery, Alfred Hitchcock's Ghostly Gallery. So these two books really became of interest to me. And I was very young when I was reading them, 7, 8, 9 years of age. So as a child, I actually thought Hitchcock had written the books. Of course, he did not. He simply put his name to the books, and I'm sure he received nice compensation for that. But the books, with their compilation of short stories, ghost stories, other stories of horror, really spurred my interest in his film and television work. So, Sidney, I'm curious, how did you first become interested in the work of Hitchcock?
Well, I have to say it was from a much different route than that. Hitchcock certainly for a long time has been the proverbial brand name, and his name has been associated with so much beyond his films, his legendary television show, products, there are Hitchcock board games. So there's all that. But I really got to Hitchcock through the films. And it took me a little while. I was around watching films while Hitchcock was making films, but I didn't see them when they first came out. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, when I was watching movies at that time in the 50s and thereabouts, hate to date myself that way, but why not? We're among friends. I was watching ghost movies. I was watching horror movies. I was watching them and The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and a lot of what I guess we're going to go on to talk about as horror films. And I didn't get to Hitchcock until substantially later. When I went off to college, this was long before there were film classes and a film major, but there were regular film screenings. And I'm so glad that the people in charge of the film screenings would more than occasionally show a Hitchcock film.
Yeah.
So that was my introduction. And actually, starting with some of his earlier ones, the Hitchcock films that these days people tend to get last rather than first. 39 Steps, The Lady Vanishes, Notorious, the kind of mid-period classics. And then I instantly was attracted and I wanted to see more and know more. And not long after that was the real explosion of accessibility with videotapes. And now you could actually get all these things, watch them at home. So I immediately revved up that. And then things just have taken off since then.
Wow.
I never met a Hitchcock film that I didn't like. And every time I watch a Hitchcock film, I want to watch it again and I want to watch more.
You remember the very first Hitchcock film you saw?
Well, I was trying to think about that, and I actually think it was, excuse me, the 39 Steps.
Mm.
And I think it was in my high school auditorium where once a month they would gather us all and show probably whatever they had available on an old 16 millimeter public domain thing. So we actually saw Citizen Kane at that point, which was wonderful. But I think that's when I remember the 39 Steps from.
Yeah.
It was only later that I came to the rest of his films. I got current with his films and then got to go way back because, as you know, but maybe not everybody listening knows, Hitchcock had a tremendously long career even before he was making the films that probably he's most well known for now. When we think Hitchcock, we probably think Psycho, and Onwards, and The Birds, and Frenzy, all those wonderful films. Well, that was not only mid-career for Hitchcock, that was probably late career. So there was so much to catch up on. And yeah, to this day, now at long last, all the films that he made that are known, there's the one, The Mountain Eagle, that's lost, but all the rest of the 50 plus films are available. I could show you them right now in video on my shelf here, and I can turn to them anytime I want.
Wow. You know, it's amazing. He goes back to the silent era and he continues into the 1970s. So he stretches through a lot of cinema history. It's kind of amazing to look at that spectrum. I'm curious, though, in terms of his national acclaim, worldwide acclaim, is there a particular film that really put Hitchcock on the map, or do you think it was more of a cumulative effect?
Well, I think it was a cumulative effect in terms of he was turning out films remarkably one a year, sometimes more than one a year, especially early on. So he built up a body of work. He built up a kind of base audience, you might say. Now, you may know he's British. He started out making films in England, was famous and popular, I was going to say almost from the very beginning. In fact, from the very beginning. He made his first film in 1925. Do the math, 100 years ago. And even when his first film came out, it was really, really well received, popular, critically received. So he had a good foundation there. Then when he moved to making films in America, excuse me, and part of the reason he made that move was because I think he had ambitions, not only in terms of better facilities to make the ambitious films he had in mind, but also he wanted even more of a worldwide audience. So when he moved to America, then things accelerated. He kept making the films. I think a real turning point came in maybe, let's call it the mid 50s or so. He had a strong audience base and he was a household word by then. But that's really when his critical acclaim started building up momentum. And there were a lot of people, a lot of critics that appreciated him, but it was especially the French critics who then, in fact, went on to make films, and very often films very influenced by Hitchcock. But they really kind of, I was going to say, took him under their wing. Now, of course, they were the young ones then, and he was the older one. So maybe that's the wrong metaphor. But they were the one whose enthusiasm and passion really brought Hitchcock to a new level. Now, he was always making good and great films, but I think people now were taking him seriously. And also critics like Truffaut and Godard and Claude Chabrol and Eric Romer, they found ways to really expand our understanding of what Hitchcock was doing. So back to your original question, there was a kind of growing momentum. And, as far as I'm concerned, I think that momentum is still going. He died however many years ago, but case in point, tonight, people are still watching his films and still talking about him.
Oh my goodness. I did not realize he went as far back as 1925.
Remarkable.
Wow. That is remarkable. I had no idea. So I'm already learning lots of new things from you already.
Well, here's the test now for you and other people listening. I'm a completist. If I get a filmmaker that I like, I want to go from A to Z, from 1 to 1,000, So I have a feeling that even people who are really into Hitchcock still have some open spaces and may not have seen something from the 30s, like the 39 Steps or the Lady Bushes, although probably most people who are into Hitchcock, they've heard of them and maybe go back. But I wonder how many people have seen a Hitchcock silent film. He made 10 silent films. And, I don't want to say everything Hitchcock touched was gold. I think, I don't want to say he had any clunkers, but I think there's something of interest in all his films. And it would be intriguing maybe for you and some of your listeners to take a leap of faith and say, you know what? I'm going to go back to early Hitchcock. And of the silent films that he made, the one that seems the most Hitchcockian, he in fact called it the first true Hitchcock film, was the third film that he made called The Lodger. Now, you could do a wonderful double feature of The Lodger, made in 1926, and then flash forward some decades and Psycho. There's a Halloween night double feature for anyone who might be interested.
Oh my gosh. So are those older movies, like, are they readily available that anybody can just pick up on maybe the Internet Archives, or where would you recommend people look for those?
Well, if you had asked this question not that many years ago, I would have said, oh, they're hard to get and they're not really the best copies. I mean, these are films that are, right, I said, 100 years old or thereabouts. But there's been so much interest in Hitchcock that, of course, there's been a certain commercial incentive to market them. And also there's been a kind of commercial and serious interest in restoring them. So you can find restored versions, really good versions, restored with good music. So for the sound films, of course, they added some music to it. But the short answer to your question is you can pretty much find everything available. You can buy them, you can stream them. Each streaming service is going to have their own little niche. But I think you can pretty much find anything, and it's a nice little adventure. Take a chance.
Oh, that's so cool. Oh, I'm definitely gonna be looking at that for the rest of this weekend. What's another little unknown fact about Alfred Hitchcock that maybe the casual fans may not know, or maybe even some hardcore fans?
Oh, let me think. Maybe it's hard to limit to that one. 'Cause there's so many interesting things, and I bet a lot of people know these things. I don't know if I have any earth-shattering revelations, but maybe I can come up with a couple of things. Um, how about this for a sort of cutesy saying that Hitchcock not only made silent films, but he was deeply influenced by the art of silent filmmaking. And even when there was a transition to the sound period, which he made very smoothly, very quickly, his first sound film, Blackmail, which he actually made in a silent version and a sound version, this made in 1929. It's almost as though sound film burst out from him fully made. It was called the first talking film ever made in England. So it's not as though he had a lot of models to learn from, but he was the model and he picked it up very quickly. But back to the point, he was not only a silent filmmaker and tremendously influenced by not only many silent films that he saw, which include probably some ones that are big on your list, The Cabinet of Caligari and Nosferatu, what we would call these days horror films, Metropolis, I guess what we would call a horror/science film. But in any event, what I'm leading up to, even when he made the transition to making sound films, he kept a lot of the old silent film approach to making films. So he was a master of dialogue and music and sound effects, but he was a master of what he liked to call pure cinema. And the short version of that is visual storytelling. So I don't know if that's actually news to all your viewers, but think back about Psycho. The most famous moment in Psycho, probably one of the most famous moments in all of cinema. Now, I don't want to say it's silent. You know the sequence I'm talking about, and of course we hear it, but there's no dialogue. So that's part of what he considered to be his lifelong dedication to pure cinema, visual storytelling. So I hope that's kind of a teasing little way, maybe even a new way of looking at Hitchcock that maybe might not have crossed our minds. There are long stretches in Hitchcock's films, even his later ones, that are without dialogue. But we know what's happening. We never lose track of what's happening. So that legacy of silent filmmaking is one that lasted from the beginning to the end of his career. So you and your listeners, when you next time you watch a Hitchcock film, Hitchcock, they joked in his conversation with Truffaut, which is a wonderful book length compilation of interviews that they had. Hitchcock was very proud of what he said was, if you went into a cinema and the sound apparatus broke, you would still stay watching the film and you would still get what was happening because of this, pure cinema that he practiced. So maybe try watching a Hitchcock film with that in particular in mind. Long stretches of silence, but boy, we stay hooked. Now, I wonder if filmmakers could do that these days. I don't know.
Oh, that's interesting. That's so fascinating. I mean, you've been studying Alfred Hitchcock for such a long time and you've seen his movies. Is there a film that you find like extra frightening or a little bit unsettling? Is there one that kind of like tops your list for that?
I'll think about that and I may come up with I may not come up with one, I may come up with a top 10 or something like that. But at the risk of overstating, there is something, and I want to use the term carefully, there's something frightening, worrisome, something that shakes me up in every Hitchcock film.
Hmm.
That includes a couple of films that he made that he said were comedies. But he also considered, if not, you probably know that he often described Psycho as, in many respects, a comedy. So there was always a comic element in Hitchcock. But back to your point, I think there's something in every Hitchcock film that gives me a little bit of a shakeup. And I'm using that term carefully, because that's a term that he used. He did a lot of writing on film and a lot of interviews. And in one of his relatively early written pieces, when he was kind of exploring, what kind of films does he make, and why does he make them? One of the things that he said, and I don't know if I'm quoting exactly, but it's pretty close. He said he wanted to make films that give the audience good, healthy, emotional shakeups. And that was the term he used. And that's why I used the term that he actually used rather than fright, because there's a certain amount of fear. He actually wrote an essay called The Enjoyment of Fear. So he knew that. But shakeups. And when I think of every Hitchcock film, there are usually more than a few moments that shake me up, make me think, make me worry a little bit. Now, Hitchcock used the expression healthy emotional shakeups. No, he wanted to do more than just scare the hell out of us. So I think that answers your question. So, I mean, you could name a film, and I could probably come up with a moment, and most of them are fairly dramatic, but they might not be quite as shockingly dramatic as the main reference point for them all, the shower sequence. But he's got lots of moments that, oh my God, they shake me up.
Oh my gosh, I love your answer. Thank you so much.
You mentioned earlier, Sidney, the 1950s, when that critical acclaim really started coming his way.
Yeah.
And that's when films like Rear Window, Vertigo, North by Northwest come out. Now, these are films best described as thrillers, not really horror. But based on what you just said, you must see aspects of horror in each of these films. So let's start with Rear Window. What part of that movie or parts of that movie are really best described as a horror type film?
Well, I've got one that comes right to mind. I don't know how well you know the film or how well your viewers know it. And I always am tempted to say, spoiler alert or whatever. But the interesting thing about Hitchcock is I don't think there is such thing as a spoiler alert. Maybe we'll talk about this later, but one of the fundamental aspects of his notion of suspense is not that he's going to have somebody leap out of a closet and scare the hell out of us and give us a 5-second emotional rush, but that he's going to prepare it carefully. So there are no spoilers for Hitchcock. Suspense is letting us in. But at the risk of spoiling something about what happens towards the end of Rear Window, the bad guy, the real villain of the piece, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about Hitchcock's villains, because there's so much more than just villains. In any event, Thorwald, who's played by Raymond Burr, who you may know from other things, including he was one of the great heavies in a number of film noirs that were made. So we kind of go into the film looking at this guy saying, okay, we know a little bit about him already. Anyway, at one point, the Jimmy Stewart character, who has been watching Thorwald across the courtyard, separated by some distance. And of course, he suspects that Thorwald might be a murderer. Well, at one point, they really become more and more certain that Thorwald is guilty. Thorwald makes his way over to the character's name is Jeffries, to Jeffrey's apartment. You hear him, his steps, his heavy footsteps coming down in the dark. And then he comes in the room. Well, that's a long-winded way of saying when you look at Raymond Burr, really imposing physical presence, and he attacks Jimmy Stewart and throws him around the room and ultimately throws him out the window. That's right out of a horror film. So Hitchcock knew horror films. He had mixed feelings about them, but he certainly knew how to build up something that was maybe even one step beyond a thrill. I think that could have been right out of a horror film.
Yeah. It's interesting. Raymond Burr in that film, first time I watched it, he was almost unrecognizable to me. He's heavier. They put makeup on him to make him look older and
Yes.
graver. And, of course, I remember him, Perry Mason and
That's right, me too.
he's a good guy. So I don't really remember him as a villain, but he's great in that role. He's phenomenal.
He is. And like I said, he had a little bit of a kind of, screen presence as a heavy before that.
Yeah.
But, and actually Hitchcock, like so many directors, likes to build off that, an actor's presence cumulatively. So the fact that we had seen Jimmy Stewart in this movie and It's a Wonderful Life, and then maybe an Anthony Mann thriller or whatever, there is a kind of cumulative power in an actor's presence. But there's also a way in which, for a good director, all you need to know you see in the film itself. And right from the very beginning, the Thorwald character, I think we're glad that we see him at a distance because he's so frightful, fearful looking. I don't think we want to be close up with him.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Hitchcock squeezes all the effect that he can out of that when he shows us Thorwald in close-up in his room. But no, he is a foreboding presence. But when I said a moment ago, maybe a little bit cryptically, villains in Hitchcock are interesting, you tell me if you would agree with me, not only with Thorwald in mind, but even with the other great, I was going to say villains or characters that do horrifying things in a Hitchcock film. There are moments in which, dare I say, our heart goes out to them. When Thorwald bursts into the room, we're frightened, but he says to Jeffries, "What do you want? Why are you bugging me?"
Right.
And I think there's a way in which we see him not only as a murderer, but as a really kind of pathetic person who has problems of his own. I think that's part of the complexity of a Hitchcock film. We get frightened, and there are people that do some pretty awful things, but there are moments in which they're humanized, for lack of a better term. And I would go so far as to say, I think Psycho, of course, is probably one of our main reference points tonight. I'm not telling you anything you don't know when I say that, sometimes we look at the Tony Perkins character and we are so frightened and so worried and so creeped out. And sometimes I think, again, for lack of a better term, he's humanized. Our heart goes out to him. He is a human being. I think one of his great insights is, well, there are monsters in the world, but they're human beings that are monsters and do horrifying things. But again, that's part of that broad humanity that he's investigating in his films.
I think you're absolutely right. A lot of his villains, he gives you seeds of hope, either early on or later on in the characterization, where you think, well, maybe this guy is innocent, or maybe this guy is not so bad.
Yeah.
He does have that multidimensional villain that he creates, which sets him apart from many other filmmakers. Let's talk a little bit about Vertigo. Now, when that came out, I was reading in a book today by Peter Ackroyd, pretty good biography of Hitchcock.
Very good book.
That came out. That was not a big hit with critics or fans. Now it's revered as one of the greatest films of all time.
Yeah.
Is there any scene from Vertigo or any aspect of Vertigo that you think is emblematic of horror?
Well, yes. I think there again, Scotty is the character name. Again, played by Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart was Hitchcock's guy. Him and Cary Grant. If I have my numbers right, each of them was in 4 Hitchcock films, and Hitchcock really knew how to use them. Now, in Vertigo, and I was going to preface this by saying, I hope this doesn't sound too shocking, but I think these days it's not a shocking statement at all to say that even though the Jimmy Stewart character in Vertigo is played, he's manipulated, he is the victim of a really, really malevolent scheme. And there's a worse person in the film than him. As it turns out, Scotty, the Jimmy Stewart character, he does some pretty awful things in his treatment, ironically, of the woman that he is so passionately in love with. I hate to get cliched about it, but maybe his love drives him a little bit mad, or maybe there is something in love that is, if not madness, then borders on irrationality and uncontrollable passions. So that's a kind of long-winded way of saying that a lot of the things that our quote unquote hero does, the Jimmy Stewart character does, are, if not right out of a horror film, they're really shocking. They shake me up when I say, how can you treat someone like this?
Yeah.
The one example that comes to mind is from the very end of the film, when the proverbial cat is out of the bag and he realizes that he has been victimized by this really intricate and really malicious and malevolent murder scheme, as it turns out. Needless to say, he's a little bit upset. And he's in the tower with Judy, the Kim Novak character, and he wants to take her up to the so-called scene of the crime, which is at the top of this bell tower. And he drags her up the stairs, and it's quite brutal, quite physical. And there's one shot where you see just her legs as she's being boom, 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 carried up the stairs, quite physically by him. Again, that seems to me that's right out of a horror film. But also, Hitchcock didn't necessarily have to see horror films to get that. There's a kind of, horror films have deep roots in other horror films came from places that Hitchcock too had visited. So Gothic romances and Gothic thrillers, if I say that's right out of a horror film, that's right out of a Gothic film, including going up, to the heights of this real spire. It's almost like a medieval kind of thing. So, there are some horrific and horror film aspects in Vertigo.
Yeah.
I think Hitchcock tried to draw on all the available cinematic resources that he could. And that includes stylistically, technically, but that also includes that kind of genre. So there's going to be a little bit of a horror film, maybe a little bit of a screwball comedy, maybe a little bit of a, fill in the blank. But yeah, it's nice that you're calling attention to the horror / Gothic side of Hitchcock. It was there.
Then you have North by Northwest, which is an absolute masterpiece.
Yeah.
So is it the scene there with the crop duster or something else that really jumps out at you in terms of being truly frightening?
Well, North by Northwest is not a film that I feel that kind of shock effect the way I do in so many of the other effects. And part of the reason is I think Cary Grant, nothing's ever going to muss Cary Grant's hair, he's going to be okay.
How does he go through that entire movie with his suit without a wrinkle, without a stain of dirt. It's unbelievable. I mean, part of it is Cary Grant, but
He is Cary Grant. But don't
kind of
forget,
watching them.
when he comes back from the crop duster scene, he actually is a little bit mussed up. But the first thing they do is he takes his suit off and they send it down to be pressed and washed.
Right.
So it's as though he's saying, "Hey, I'm Cary Grant," you know. But back to your question, I think it's a thriller. I think it's something that I get actually more wrapped up in the intricacies of the romantic part of the film, of his relationship with the Eva Marie Saint character, Eve Kendall. And that has some bumpy moments, not the least of which is when she sends him out to that place to be murdered. That is, to me, the creepiest moment of the film. But it's not a visceral kind of thing, like something happening to a character. And then when he is attacked by the crop duster, it seems to me, on the one hand, dangerous, of course, because and his expression is so wonderful. He's looking up at this plane and he's kind of saying, "Well, what's happening?" And then the plane is coming after him, and he still has this, "I can't believe this is happening." And so I guess I say that by way of saying I don't get quite as wrapped up in a sense of danger, but it is thrilling and it is exciting. But North by Northwest has those creepy moments, like the one I mentioned, when he goes back to see Eve Kendall, who he's been attracted to, and he realizes that she has set him up to be murdered. So that's the best I can come up with. I don't know if you have a better example, but there is that kind of creepiness in the North by Northwest for me, but it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Name another film and I can probably come up with something a little creepier.
All right, let's talk about what may be his most iconic film, 1960s Psycho. Really his first true horror movie. Why, Sidney, do you think he decided to venture into the horror genre full bore? This was quite a leap from his earlier material. Why do you think he did it?
Well, okay. That is really a good question, and I'm thinking it through. I mean, I've thought about things like that. I still need to figure it out a little bit more, so I'll do the best I can. One of the things that I would start by saying is it is the most horror-like film of Hitchcock, but I'm not sure it qualifies as a dyed-in-the-wool, out-and-out horror film. And in part, if you were to say, well, then what kind of film is it? It's a Hitchcock film. And I think what Hitchcock liked to do is he liked to take a genre and then he liked to play with it. So I think you're absolutely right that he is working from or with the horror genre. And you have the creepy house and you have the hint of the supernatural. And if not the supernatural, then the really spooky, the corpse of the mother. And then of course you have not only a monster, but this is one of the elements of a horror film. He's a monster that is close to us. I mean, there are monster films that envision the monster as from outer space or something like that. But then there is a thread going through horror films, and especially modern day horror films. And I think especially with Hitchcock in mind, that say, well, here's the monster and he lives next door, or he is like the boy next door. So part of what I'm kind of rolling around in my head is the way that he uses the conventions of the horror genre, but he plays with them and he toys with them. So that would be my starting point anyway.
Yeah.
So I guess when you say, well, why would he make a film like this? I guess part of what I would say is he'd been making Hitchcockian films or his whole career. And I don't think this is completely anomalous. It is an extension of them, but I don't think it's like he's breaking fresh ground. I talked about a double feature before, The Lodger, his early film, and Psycho. You could do a double feature with Psycho and Shadow of a Doubt, the film that he made in the early 40s, in 1943, which has so many of the elements of Psycho. It doesn't quite have the incredible shower murder sequence, but it has so many of the themes and the creepiness and the censor of the monster. Oh, and how about this? The monster that not only lives next door, but he's not only inside your own house, but he comes from your family. So I hope I'm not going too far afield with that, but I think there's continuity there with Psycho and previous films. And at the same time, he is drawing from the horror genre. And the final thing that I'll say that brings me back more to your point, which is Hitchcock was a great film watcher as well. And he was watching the kind of films that were coming out at the same time as his, now in the 1950s. So he was not only watching Antonioni and La Ventura, which came out, I think, in the same year, 1959, 1960. And he was watching the French New Wave films. But more to my point, he was watching the American international films that were kind of, we might call them exploitation films, but they were, kind of not particularly imaginative, but they were horror films and they were popular. And I think Hitchcock wanted to kind of take advantage of at least a little bit of that wave.
Yeah.
And part of it is because he knew that, or he sensed that the audiences were changing and they were getting more accustomed to different kinds of films. And there was a way in which he felt he had to change. And then I think he also had a sense that the audience was getting younger. So that's the best I can come up with of kind of multiple paths that led him towards Psycho. But again, I think there is a way in which Psycho is a Hitchcockian film. And there are lots of connections between it and the films that he had been making. Now, you wouldn't get that necessarily by doing a double feature of Rear Window and Psycho, right, but you would if you did Suspicion or Shadow of a Doubt or Strangers on a Train. So there's a certain amount of continuity. All those films, by the way, also in black and white.
Yeah. Very interesting. So he takes chances here. You mentioned black and white. So he makes this movie in black and white at a time when most feature films are starting to be made in color. And he'd been working in color throughout much of the 50s.
Yeah.
He also kills off the protagonist early on. That's almost unheard of. So he's taking some chances here. Do you think he realized the risks? Or did he just think that this was, I don't want to say a throwaway film, but he made it pretty inexpensively. He didn't necessarily think it was that great a movie. He wondered why it got more attention than some of the other movies he'd made earlier. So do you think he's realizing the risks, or does he think, I'm just going to experiment a little bit. It's not that big a deal?
Well, I hope this doesn't sound like I'm trying to take a safe route, but I would say yes and yes.
Okay.
I think Hitchcock from the very beginning was very shrewd commercially. He had his eyes on the audience. He had the eyes on what was commercial, and he didn't let that overwhelm him so much so that he made films predominantly or specifically for that purpose. But he was a realist, and he knew you had to get an audience. You had to put fannies in the seat, as they say. So he was aware to that commercial side. He was also aware that you have to stay within a budget, and that if your films don't make money, you might not be able to make the next one. So the commercial considerations were very important for him. And he also wanted to make money for himself. So in terms of the deal with Psycho, he ended up basically taking it away from the studio in a kind of way you would say he financed it himself. He took a big risk with it commercially. He was willing to take that. I mean, he didn't back down from those kind of risks, but he also wanted to keep the budget low. So he shot it, as you know, pretty much as though he was making one of his television works, even though it was 3 times as long. But then here's the other side, the non-commercial side, the artistically ambitious and adventurous. He loved black and white, and he knew that you could do great things in black and white. The common explanation given for why he filmed Psycho in black and white is what he himself said. And he said he knew he wanted to include that violent shower sequence and the blood. And he always said if it was in color, the censors simply would not allow it. Now, that may be a little bit of a cover for the other reasons why he made it in black and white. Oh, I want to save money. And there was thought at one point when he was on a little roller coaster ride. Oh my God, did I make a great film? Or, oh no, did I make something that's not so good? So he held open the possibility that he could, if he wanted to, recut it and show it on television. But back to the more artistic thing. He made great films in black and white. He knew that you could do cinematically wonderful things in black and white. He very much talked about, I hope I'm not misquoting him or misrepresenting him, but it sounds a little cutesy for me to say, Psycho is a color film, but the colors were black and white. And he used them so creatively and effectively, and the contrasts and the darks and the bright whites. Think of the shadows, and then think of the white that is whiter than white in the murder sequence. So he shot it with the ingenuity and the adventurousness, as though he was shooting. Maybe I'm going a little bit too far with this, but really what I want to emphasize is there were legitimate artistic reasons for using black and white, and his black and white aesthetic there was really, really very effective. And there, you're right, Hollywood especially was turning to color. But the great films, especially the great films in Europe of the 1950s, up until the very end, well, most of the great ones were black and white. So he was working within, and I'm not saying he was necessarily, well, Godard made his film Breathless the year before in black and white, so I'm going to do, I'm not saying that was it. But what I am saying broadly is that black and white filmmaking was still a credible vehicle for the serious and artistically ambitious filmmakers of the time. So I don't hold black and white of Psycho against it. I think it's wonderfully done.
Oh, yeah, it definitely works. 2 more questions on Psycho. You know, we've heard all the stories of how Hitchcock treated his leading ladies, and we know that often they weren't treated very well. How about Janet Leigh? What has your research shown about the way that she was treated on the set of this movie?
Well, let's take the broad issue, which is Hitchcock these days is under fire, and a lot of it, of course, comes from Tippi Hedren. And I don't want to be dismissive of it, but I would start out by saying I think it's a very complicated issue. And it might be a little bit more complicated. There sometimes is a rush to judgment about it. Sometimes the rush to judgment turns out to be correct. But sometimes the rush to judgment oversimplifies or whatever. And in the case of Hitchcock's literal relationship with his leading women, Not that this necessarily completely contradicts. I want to be very careful I don't want to be dismissive of Tippi Hedren's claims or whatever, but there are a lot of other of the women that he worked with that say quite the opposite. He was wonderful. He was respectful. No one ever said that Hitchcock was your kind of all-round good guy, an uncomplicated person. I think he was a jokester. He was a stern taskmaster, and the men he worked with said the same thing. And when Tippi Hedren talks about he made me do this, shot 30 times or whatever, well, I think Jimmy Stewart would say the same thing, and Cary Grant would say the same thing. So in any event, you're getting back to Janet Leigh. Janet Leigh is one of the people he worked with very, very closely. Made a film with her that is very much taken as proof that Hitchcock had bad thoughts about women, which I think really misunderstands Psycho. And she spoke very highly of him from beginning to end. She wrote books. She had interviews. And I will say I had the wonderful fortune to meet her in person at a Hitchcock centennial event. Hitchcock was born in 1899. So I'm glad I was around in 1999. There's a wonderful big scholarly symposium that invited not only scholars and critics, but some of the people that he worked with, including the script writers, including Joe Stefano, who wrote the script for Psycho, and Janet Leigh. So I sat right behind her, and she was, I can't say I had an hour-long conversation with her, but at that meeting, she continued to talk very highly about Hitchcock as a person, talk very highly about their interpersonal connection and things like that. Had really, so in terms of let's gather all the witnesses to build up a full picture of what Hitchcock was like as a person, far from perfect. Oh boy. But maybe not quite what he is sometimes painted to be as a person.
Yeah.
I know I've been long-winded, but I got wind for just one more sentence that I think is important. Sure, who's not fascinated by behind-the-scenes things and what kind of people they are? But once having said that and acknowledging that, I want to return to the films, and I want to focus as much as possible. And especially if we're trying to understand, for lack of a better term, Hitchcock's take on women, let's go to the films as really primary documents. And I think when you look at his films, this might be a conveniently short version of it, but you see films that repeatedly show bad things happening to women, but films that don't celebrate it, that don't indulge in it, that say, you know what, this is life, and this is a horrible and horrifying fact of life, but I don't see Hitchcock celebrating them. And I would include Psycho there, in that as part of a picture of, there's a lot of bad things, misogyny and stuff like that. And Psycho is a very powerful picture of it, but he's not applauding it.
Now, there's no question that he was very close to his longtime wife, Alma Reville. There's a movie that came out in 2012. Anthony Hopkins played Hitchcock. I thought it was very well done. And in the film, it makes the point that Alma really made a tremendous contribution as the editor of Psycho. Is that what you believe to be true as well?
Well, a couple things. And let me start off the track for a moment by saying, we were talking a moment ago about what actors bring to their roles. And you got to figure that Anthony Hopkins brought a little bit of Hannibal Lecter to the role of Alfred Hitchcock. And that, I'm sure, has crossed the minds of many people watching that film. Not that they played that up in the film, but there is that kind of penumbra. But in any event, um, Alma is finally, I think, getting the attention and the respect that is due to her. And I'll go even one step further to say that there were not only other people that collaborated with Hitchcock that are being recognized. I mean, can you imagine, and you can read my mind, can you imagine Psycho without Bernard Herrmann?
Mm.
Nor could Hitchcock. But Hitchcock didn't go out of his way to say, oh, the latest Hitchcock film featuring or whatever. Hitchcock was not great on crediting his collaborators, but
Right.
boy, was he great at finding good people to collaborate with and really getting the most out of them. And Alma was one of them for sure, along with other women. And that's something that also is becoming more and more, researched, and people are becoming aware of the role of Joan Harrison, for example, who Hitchcock worked very closely with and who produced the Alfred Hitchcock Presents show or whatever. So this is part of a broader picture. But back to Alma, Hitchcock, when he gave credit, she was the one person that he would give credit to. Maybe otherwise he would have a hard time returning home that night or whatever, but I think it was sincere. You could do a whole show, well, maybe not on the horror genre, but one could do a whole show, a Hitchcock related show on Hitchcock and Alma, or just on Alma. But I guess the short answer to your question is she was a major contributor, but I don't know that in particular that she contributed to. She was an editor, by the way. So she certainly would have given him advice through his entire career. And before you give advice, sometimes you have to be asked. And you get a sense that Hitchcock frequently asked Alma, what do you think about this? And there are specific stories about moments in Psycho where he said he had Alma watch them, and Alma made a comment that you got to make a change here. The most famous of them is at the end of the murder sequence. We all gravitate towards the part of it, but the 2 minutes after it is so powerful and so suspenseful and so moving and shocking in many ways. And you may remember that last close-up when the camera moves in close to Janet Leigh and the eye. Well, when Alma was watching it, she turned to Hitchcock and said, she blinked, or there's a movement of her eye. You've got to cut that out. And evidently they went back and cut it out. That by way of saying he did rely on her.
Sure.
But in terms of the overall structure and the editing, I'm sure she was a contributor, but I don't know. You don't necessarily. I think we need to get a sense that that when we talk about a Hitchcock film, there were lots of contributors to it, but that doesn't mean we should ever forget Hitchcock.
Sure. Our guest is Sidney Gottlieb, a professor, one of the leading experts that we have in this country or any other country on Alfred Hitchcock. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be right back on the Ghostly Gallery podcast. We are back on the Ghostly Gallery podcast and continuing really a fascinating discussion with Professor Sidney Gottlieb about the impact of Alfred Hitchcock. So, Sidney, let's talk about another Hitchcock classic from the 60s, The Birds. This is actually my favorite of all his films, and really, I guess, the only one that I'm aware of, you can correct me if I'm wrong, really the only one that delves somewhat into a supernatural theme. This idea that birds could actually band together in mass and attack humanity. Scientists, bird experts, I've heard them say this cannot happen. Kind of an interesting decision here for Hitchcock to venture almost into science fiction slash supernatural.
Yeah. I think there's an interesting pun that leaps out when you say supernatural, because normally when we use the term supernatural, you think about, ghosts and things like that. But bear with me, this is super nature. This is nature empowered. These are birds that are part of our everyday natural life that all of a sudden they unionize and they become incredibly powerful. So it is in the way, in that punning way, it is kind of supernatural. A lot of when people come to explain this film, if they say, why did the birds do what they did? And people bandy about the idea that, well, this is nature's revenge on us. We've done such horrible things to them that now this is their chance to do some pretty bad things to us. But again, yeah, not supernatural, not insofar as there are ghosts, but it is really the rare Hitchcock film where the violence that's perpetrated is not caused by human. We are victimized by it, but this is not human on human violence. But this is still, to a certain extent, in keeping with his perennial theme, which is violence is a fact of life. And a large part of his films revolve around how we deal with violence. And again, it, as you say, it comes from a different area, but it's still the same realm of experience. How do we as human beings respond to violence and trauma? Hitchcock is, from the very beginning, if I say fascinated, that might sound too glib, because I think he's very worried about it. But his recurrent focus is violence and trauma in human life, and this just ramps it up a little bit. And interestingly enough, he's not concerned with the human motivation for wreaking violence on other humans. He's looking at it, if you will, very much from the victim's point of view, which was always a part of the films that he made.
Yeah. The imagery in The Birds is astounding. You've got the explosion at the gas station, the scene of the children running from the Bodega Bay schoolhouse, just incredible images. Is there one particular scene that really sticks out for you in The Birds?
For a long time, The Bird, I was always struck by it when I first saw it. It was never one of my favorite films, and it was never a film that, as a teacher, part of what you try to do is squeeze the significance out of the film. It's one thing to just say, hey, this is 2 hours of pretty amazing entertainment and enjoyment. And I'm not sure I was on its wavelength. And, actually, I say the same thing about Psycho. I had to grow into Psycho, and I think I've had to grow into The Birds. And one of the things that's really helped me to not only get a sense that this is a masterful film, this is an incredibly powerful and insightful film, but to get more of a sense of the dual focus of the film. There is the drama and the excitement and the horror of the bird attacks. And those are, when you said, what are the things that I remember? Oh my God, I can flash back on the scenes that are so striking. The bird attacks, but also the results of the bird's violence, where you don't actually see what happened. But when you see the body of the man who was kind of pecked apart, Dan Fawcett, oh my God, can you ever forget? I was going to say that image. Hitchcock doesn't want us to forget it. So he gives us boom, boom, boom. He gives us 3 right in a row. Can you ever forget coming across the body of Annie, the Suzanne Plachette character? And we don't see her killed, but we see the result of the bird violence. So that to me is a testament to Hitchcock's ability to create powerful sequences that I, of course, gravitate towards the ones that literally, I was going to say fly out at us. But they're the subtle moments where, again, like the examples that I gave there. And then also, how about the sequence when they're waiting for the bird attack and they're just all in the living room and you cut from one character to another. And then you see a long shot with them in this living room that looks like it takes up an enormous amount of space and they're just waiting and waiting. And then you hear and that to me is memorable, maybe as memorable as the drama of what you see when the birds actually do the attacking. So it's an incredible film that is memorable on so many different levels.
So this was Tippi Hedren's debut film. Did you ever have a chance to meet her or interview her at all?
I did not, and I've read her interviews and her comments, and especially of late. I mean, I want to be knowledgeable about latest developments and what she said recently, but I haven't really made it a passion to keep up with it all. But I actually, the most that I've read and heard from her and about her is that in the archives, there are tapes of sessions that Hitchcock had with his various technicians, with the sound people, with the people that were involved in putting the film together. And there are tapes of Hitchcock talking with Tippi Hedren about the role. And they, to me, are fascinating. And as you might expect, they're mostly Hitchcock, but there is a kind of interaction, and there is, to my mind, and I'm not going to try to prettify it, or glorify it, or overstate the case, but there is a sense of 2 people working well together. One person, obviously the director, this was her first film, not only with him, but her first film. She had done television commercials and stuff like that.
Right.
So she was the newcomer. But to me, listening to and then reading the transcriptions of them talking together and working together, and for all that I can see, working very well together, very professionally. If I say cordially, I'm not paid by the Hitchcock estate to make excuses for Hitchcock. I'm not, who knows what he did behind closed doors or whatever. But I am saying that this documentation of them actually at work together is just really, really wonderful to see. And Hitchcock was a very strong-willed director, and he did not hesitate to kind of say, do this, look up at this time. And if Montgomery Clift, as was recorded, would say, what's my motivation? Hitchcock would say, because the next shot is going to show what you're looking at, and I've got to have it in the film. So we're not talking about depth psychology. We're talking about putting together all the pieces of a film so they fit well together. So that's a way of saying, to have these backstage views of Hitchcock working with his technicians, with his actors, including Tippi Hedren, to me, that's the glimpse of Hitchcock and Tippi Hedren that I really like to pay the most attention to.
Oh, awesome.
It's incredible. I think she is very, very good in The Birds. And Marnie, the next film, where she has come under a fair amount of criticism, I guess I'll just say blankly, I think she works well in the 2 Hitchcock films that she made. And I think she clearly brought something to it.
Mhm.
I think Hitchcock was an essential ingredient, as he was with the other actors that he worked with. He brought the best out of them and made them integral parts of a Hitchcock film.
Oh, wonderful. Have you ever had a chance to go visit any site locations for some of these movies where they were filmed?
I have not. Everybody in the world seems
Oh,
to have been to the Universal Studios and Bates Motel, or it's done done the Vertigo tour. But you know what? Actually, I have to backtrack. I am I'm a big fan of all of Hitchcock's films, but for a long time I had a particular interest in his British films, and especially the early ones, and
mhm.
maybe in part because they needed a little bit of special pleading. They weren't nearly as well known, so I guess I kind of felt I wanna give them equal, due or whatever. So when I was in London at one point, I did go on a walk that went to not so much the sites of his British films,
Mhm.
but the place where he and Alma lived at a certain point, the little chapel where he got married, the Islington where the first studio that he worked with was. So I did do a little bit of that kind of fan stuff, which was terrific. So
Mhm.
maybe it's someday I will visit those sites or those sets, but I haven't. But I hear they're quite remarkable.
Mm.
Oh, awesome.
You
Oh, thank
have been,
you.
I guess? Have you been to those sites?
Nope, not yet.
Well, then
Someday, maybe.
let's all go together. Let's play.
It would be fun.
Speaking of Great Britain, 1972, he goes back there to film a movie that is less acclaimed, but I think deserves more attention,
Yeah.
and that's Frenzy. And here we see the dark and the seedy side of London. What's your thoughts on this movie?
Um, I find Frenzy to be a very disturbing film. I find it to be a very powerful film. It's very often used, not by everybody, but it's very often used as kind of further fodder, shall I say, for the argument, oh, Hitchcock didn't think well of women or he glorified this or that. It's a film that, as you know, shows very disturbing violence against women, mistreatment of women, and even when misogyny doesn't take ultra-violent forms, it's unpleasant and it's painful, and there's a lot of that in Frenzy. But to my mind, this is a film that is very much against it, very much pointing out the horrors of it, not indulging in it in any way. When the men in the bar make that horrifying joke about, well, this is a person who sexually assaults and then murders somebody, and they make that joke that's so horrifying, I don't even want to repeat it. Hitchcock is not, we're not supposed to laugh along with that joke. I think we're supposed to say, these are awful people. This is an awful mentality. And in the very shocking murder in that film, which, as you know, is, well, there's a shocking murder in Psycho, but it's done so differently. Um, we could say it's stylized, and Hitchcock, it's shocking. Oh, and it's still horrifying, but it's not graphic in the way that, we may get to this later, but that sometimes people who think they are followers of Hitchcock think they're being Hitchcockian when they show graphic, disturbing kind of explicit violence. I don't think that's being Hitchcockian. But in any event, the murder sequence, the one that I'm talking about in Frenzy, is quite brutal. And I think it's meant to be shocking and horrifying, and our hearts go out for the woman who has been victimized that way. But Frenzy has moments of subtlety as well. And I think Hitchcock was rightly proud about this. He trusted audiences, not only to trust him, but to be a vital component of the overall effect of his films. And he wanted us, he did the heavy lifting, he did the presenting, and, he wanted to kind of shock and provoke and things like that. But he also wanted us to be thoughtful and alert audiences and appreciated his subtlety. So the second murder sequence is something he doesn't show at all. He shows the lead up to it. We know what's coming. And I'm tempted to say something it's almost as horrifying as the first one. And I want to be careful with that because the first one is really meant to hit us hard. But I think we're hit quite hard by the second murder, which we don't see. And maybe we imagine it, although I don't know that we go into graphic detail, but we imagine it insofar as we know that it's happening. So that, by way of saying, Frenzy, I think, sometimes has got a little bit of a bad rap. But I think there are real Hitchcockian moments that are very powerful, and there is some real artistry. I don't think it ranks as one of his, if you gotta say the top 10 or the top 5 or whatever, but you're putting that in pretty good company. It's a film that a lot of directors would have been very happy and very proud to have on their resume.
I think it's really good. I think it's underrated.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess part of why I said what I said is, I'm so enthusiastic about Hitchcock, I have to resist the temptation to say, he made 53 films and they were all masterpieces. I mean, I don't think they were. But as I started out by saying, there is something of real interest in everything that he did. And I'm not so sure how much value there is necessarily in the rankings game. This is the best film of all time. This is the best film of all time. No, I mean, appreciate each film for what it is. Have a sense of value. Have a sense of why there's a difference between a film like Vertigo and a film like Jamaica Inn, which is a film he made. Also, by the way, based on, in this case, a novel by Daphne du Maurier. He loved Daphne du Maurier.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he went on to make Rebecca, which is a much better novel than Jamaica Inn is. And then The Birds is a story based on a Daphne du Maurier story.
Yeah.
But again, my point was, let's watch his films and be open to what they bring to us. And we may want to make some value judgments about it, but I think the real challenge is to respond fully to them and not necessarily to rank them. But I go back to what you said. I think it is underrated, and I think it's a film worth watching again, but it's a tough watch.
As we get set to wrap up this terrific interview, we've really enjoyed it. We're going to let Tracy have the last question.
My goodness. So I'm just going to ask you one question, and let me just see here. It is, if you could describe Alfred Hitchcock's legacy in one word, what would that be?
One word. Oh, I mean, if this last hour and a half proven anything, is one word is about my chosen format. But let me see if I can at least one word. How about a tiny little phrase?
Okay.
Along the lines of always worth the effort, always worth pursuing. If you've seen Vertigo, watch Vertigo again. But if you haven't seen, and there's so many, and again, I don't want to obligate everybody to watch all the 50 plus films. And he also, by the way, he didn't direct nearly all the shows on his television program, but he made 20, what I think are really kind of wonderful mini movies that were shown on television. So I don't want to obligate everybody to go out there and, okay, we're going to start at this and go through the whole roster or whatever, but always worth the effort. Go to a Hitchcock film that you haven't seen maybe, but that's been highly recommended, and we've recommended a bunch of them, or take a chance, spin the wheel or whatever. I think you'll find something of interest. So I wasn't able to give you the one word. Maybe that short phrase may mean something.
It
Always, yeah.
does. It does. And I honestly, this has been such a blast this evening. I think we need to have you back again for a part 2.
I'm going to hold you to that. I would. And, this was such a wonderful three-way conversation. And, we bounce off each other. And the prospect of doing it again, I'm down.
Sounds
Love
very
it.
good to me. Yeah. Our guest has been Professor Sidney Gottlieb, Sacred Heart University, currently teaching a course on Hitchcock. He has been at the university for many years now, doing a wonderful job as Professor of Communications and Media Studies. He's also the co-editor of the Hitchcock Annual and has edited a number of books on the legendary Alfred Hitchcock. Our thanks to Sidney Gottlieb. Thank you, Sidney.
Thank you. This was terrific.
Our thanks to Sidney and, of course, my co-host and wonderful producer, executive producer, Tracy Asteria. We thank all of you for joining us in this Museum of the Macabre, and we do hope we'll see you again next time right here in Alfred Hitchcock's Ghostly Gallery.